Now, we've got something I know you've been looking forward to for a while. We're going to hear from our final panel on reading curriculum. I'm going to hand it back over to Todd Collins, who will moderate the session and introduce the panelists. You may need to tell a friend to tell a friend to tell two more friends. They need to jump on to the Zoom link and check out this final panel.
So welcome to our final panel, which is reading curriculum, finding programs that make a difference. I'm Todd Collins. I'm one of the organizers of the California Reading Coalition, and I'll be moderating what is really an outstanding panel. We've got some of the nation's leading thinkers on what makes for an effective reading curriculum. So let's put up that first slide if we can. So first we've got Natalie Wexler. Natalie is an education writer and notably the author of The Knowledge Gap, which is published in 2019, that brought to the mainstream discussion the long-simmering concern about background knowledge and its fundamental role in reading comprehension. And let's go to the next slide. And we also have Meredith and David Liben from Reading Done Right. After many years as teachers and running schools, the Libens have focused on translating research on reading and the brain into practical applications for teachers and students. Their recent book, Know Better, Do Better, Teaching the Foundation So Every Child Can Read, is a deeply practical book on how schools can be more effective at putting evidence-based reading practices into everyday use. So let's take the slides down for a second. Let me spend a couple of minutes providing some context. Reading, of course, is the foundation of most academic learning, and one of the core pillars of teaching reading is curriculum. Reading curriculum has gone through many waves of change, from the McGuffey readers in the 1800s to Dick and Jane books that I grew up with, the trade books used during whole language, and up to some of the current basal readers that have become popular the last 20 years. The last few years, we've seen science of reading concepts create waves of change and renewed focus on early literacy in states and school systems around the country. And as we'll hear, we're seeing new and different kinds of reading programs become increasingly popular. And that's why earlier this year, our group, the California Reading Coalition, set out to find what reading programs California districts were actually using. So let's look at that first slide if we can. We researched the reading programs of the 331 largest school districts in California. And last month we released the California Reading Curriculum Report, which looks at what those districts use and what it can tell us about California's reading success. You can find that report along with detailed data on every district that we gather data from, as well as supplements, interventions, and assessments on our website at careads.org. And we had a number of interesting findings, but today I'm going to focus on just two. On that next slide, we can see that while California prides itself on strong local control, in fact, over 80% of districts use just one of just three reading programs: McGraw-Hill's Wonders, Benchmarks Advance, and Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's Journeys. Wonders and Advance alone are used by over 70% of districts. Now, we're obviously a very big state with over 1,000 independently governed school districts all making their own choices. But even with that, over 80% chose programs that in the scheme of things are very, very similar. So let's go to the next slide. At the same time, we found that less than 2% of districts use programs generally viewed as aligned with the science of reading, including building background knowledge. And we're going to talk about that specifically, that list of curriculum shortly. We drew that list from, can we go to the next slide? We drew that list from a group put out by Knowledge Matters Campaign, who teamed up with David and Meredith to put it together. Out of our 331 districts, we found only five districts that were using any of the programs they identified, as you can see on that slide. So of those 6 programs that Knowledge Matters identified as top tier programs, we found only one that had more than a single California district using it. Half of the programs had no California districts using them at all. I should call out one major exception, though, that wasn't captured in our report. Our report didn't include Los Angeles Unified, which of course is our largest district, since they use multiple programs across their very many schools. But fully half of all LAUSD schools are using Core Knowledge Language Arts, usually called CKLA, which has been a tremendous validation point for other California districts. Okay, can we turn the slides off now? So that's the context for today's discussion. We're going to talk about what makes for a good reading curriculum and what some of these specific curriculums, specific programs are. And as we do that, it's important to keep in mind that some of the changes in reading approaches that have been happening over the last 10 years in other parts of the US, by and large, have not yet reached us in California. We're behind. And we don't expect the state to issue new textbook recommendations until at least 2027, 5 years from now. That's a long time. And so we need to think about what we need to do if we want to see change earlier. Okay, that's enough from me. Let me turn to you, Natalie. So much of the discussion about reading programs in California has centered on foundational skills in phonics, but you've emphasized a different aspect of reading research that's been missed. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. And I want to just say thank you, Todd, for inviting me and David and Meredith, and because it is important to expand the discussion about reading beyond foundational skills. And teaching foundational skills is hugely important, but too often that's, that the discussion about science of reading is focused on fixing problems with our approaches to decoding instruction. And there may be a mention that, of course, comprehension is important, but you could easily come away with the impression that the only thing we need to change about our approach to literacy reading instruction is our approach to phonics and decoding. And in fact, I would argue that the problems with our approach to reading comprehension are even more widespread and better hidden. So what is the standard approach to reading comprehension? Well, it's approached generally as a set of skills and strategies. There are a number of them out there, lists, and this is just one I found on the internet. And so the teacher will generally model a skill or strategy, maybe a skill of the week, comparing and contrasting, finding the main idea, etc. And then the other part of this approach has kids going off to practice that skill or strategy on books that have been determined to be at their individual reading level. And the content of the books that are being used for modeling, that are being used for practice, that's really not considered all that important. So there'll be, zebras one day, clouds the next, and there'll be a basket of books on all sorts of different topics, because the theory is that if kids just get really good at those skills, they'll be able to use them to glean knowledge from any text that's put in front of them. So if you're good at finding the main idea, you'll be able to find the main idea. You'll apply that skill to any text. And in fact, cognitive scientists discovered quite a while ago, that's really not the way reading comprehension works. So if we could have the next slide. So this was a study some of you may have heard of called the baseball study. It was done back in the late 1980s, and the researchers wanted to test what is more important in being a good comprehender of what you're reading. Is it general skill at something like finding the main idea, these skills that are supposedly assessed by reading comprehension tests? Or is it how much the reader knows about the topic? And they chose the topic of baseball because they were doing this with like 7th and 8th graders, and they figured, well, there are a lot of kids out there who are not generally good readers, but they do know a lot about baseball. So they divided these kids into 4 different groups, depending on how well they had scored on a standardized reading comprehension test and how much they knew about baseball. And then they gave them all a passage to read describing a baseball game and tested their comprehension of that passage. And what they found was that what really made the difference was how much the kids knew about baseball when they were reading about baseball. So that dark green bar, the one that's circled that's taller, those are the kids who did not do well on the standardized comprehension test. Those are the poor readers who knew a lot about baseball. And that much shorter blue bar to the right of it, those are the supposedly good readers who didn't know much about baseball. So clearly, when you know more about a topic, you're going to be better able to understand a text on that topic. So that tells us that these comprehension skills and strategies are not skills just like riding a bike. They don't just get better with practice. It's going to depend to a large extent on the topic and the reader's knowledge. And it also tells us there's really no such thing as a fixed reading level. Again, will depend on the topic and the reader's knowledge to a large extent. But this isn't just about knowledge of specific topics. That may be fairly obvious. When you're reading about baseball, you know the lingo, you're going to be better able to understand it. But it's also true that we rely on our knowledge of the world, our general academic knowledge and vocabulary to understand virtually everything we read. And the way to build that general academic knowledge and vocabulary is through digging into specific topics. Because you can't just teach the vocabulary in the abstract. It won't stick unless there's some context, unless kids hear it repeatedly in different contexts. So if we could have the next slide. So what this leads to is something that's been called the Matthew effect, which is taken from the Gospel of St. Matthew, particularly the part that says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And what this is about is some kids are starting out with more academic knowledge and vocabulary, usually because they've been able to pick it up at home because they have more highly educated parents and they have more resources. And they, in our leveled reading system, they're able to start out reading more complex texts. They're also in a better position to retain new information from those texts because it has something to stick to. And so they can get better and better at reading because they're acquiring new information, new vocabulary, which in turn enables them to read yet more complex text. But the other kids who rely on school for this kind of knowledge and vocabulary, if they're not getting it there, they're going to fall farther and farther behind every year. So by the time kids get to upper grades to high school, that gap can be very large and very difficult to narrow. So this is why it's important to start building academic knowledge in the early years, while students are still acquiring those foundational reading skills. And that's usually going to be done through reading aloud to kids. And I'll talk about that more in just a minute. But one problem I'd like to point out is that it can look like that skills and strategies approach to comprehension is working at lower grade levels. But then it can backfire when kids reach upper grades. And that's because the texts we're asking them to read at lower grade levels don't assume all that much academic knowledge and vocabulary. So it can look like they're getting better at finding the main idea or whatever. But then when they get to higher grades where the texts do start assuming more academic knowledge, if they don't have that knowledge, they're going to hit a wall. So the good news is that there is a lot that schools and teachers can do to narrow this gap, and a lot that curriculum can do, especially a certain kind of curriculum, one that focuses on content, that builds knowledge systematically, as well as building foundational skills. So if we could go to the next slide. I'll just take a minute to explain how a knowledge building curriculum can enable students to read and write at higher levels. So first we need to understand that there are different aspects to literacy. It's not just reading. There's listening, speaking, reading, and not to be forgotten, writing. And the big difference is that listening and speaking are easier for kids. You don't have to teach them how to listen, how to speak, and you do need to teach them how to read and write. So listening and speaking are going to open up more capacity in kids' working memory, where they're taking in new information, more capacity for understanding, absorbing, retaining new information, new vocabulary. So in the first instance, before kids are fluent readers and writers, listening to complex text being read aloud and then talking about the content, using that vocabulary, that's going to be the most effective way to get knowledge into their long-term memories, vocabulary and knowledge. And then once they have some knowledge in long-term memory about a topic, they're going to be better able to read and write at higher levels about that topic because they won't have to be juggling the new information along with decoding and spelling and all of those things that we have to juggle in working memory when we're reading and writing. So an effective curriculum will, first of all, focus on content and spend at least 2 or 3 weeks or more on a single topic. Because remember, kids need to hear the same vocabulary, the same concepts repeatedly in order for those things to stick in long-term memory. And secondly, give all students access to the same complex text through read alouds and discussion, especially at lower grade levels. But even if the curriculum doesn't specify reading aloud after second grade, it could be a good idea if kids are having trouble reading the text they're expected to read. And then lastly, and crucially, engage students in listening, speaking, reading, and writing about the same content. And that's not what most curricula do now. They have kids listening to one content about one topic, but then going off to read about a different topic that they may not have much background knowledge about. So it's going to be more difficult. And then they may be writing about yet a different topic, maybe their personal experience, or maybe a topic in a separate writing curriculum. And again, that's not taking advantage of the way curriculum can bring all these things together to enable kids to read and write at a higher level. And so just to finish up, I've got one more slide, if we can go to that. So one reason we need to build foundational skills and knowledge simultaneously is that if we don't, we could find ourselves in a situation where the pendulum is going to swing away from phonics once again. So this has happened before. We may find that even if we fix our problems with decoding and foundational skills instruction, that at a certain point, people will say, well, these kids can decode complex text, but they can't understand it. And then they may say, as they have before, well, you see, phonics doesn't work. And of course, phonics alone will not equip kids to understand what they're reading. But it's been cast aside because it's not enabling kids to understand complex text. And that's because we haven't also been building that academic knowledge and vocabulary. So we need to do these things together. And it is certainly possible with a good curriculum to do these things together, not only to ensure that kids become truly literate in the sense that they have the knowledge they need to understand complex text, but also to ensure that we don't lose the progress we're making on the foundational skills end of things. So I'll stop there and turn it over, I guess, to Todd or to David and Meredith, not sure.
Thank you, Natalie. That was really interesting. The idea that we need foundational decoding skills and a foundation of knowledge seems incredibly important to me, and we just don't talk about it enough. It's not just phonics and it's not just comprehension skills. We need academic knowledge and vocabulary. So, David and Meredith, let's turn to you. How does this fit with your views of the science of reading and the work you're doing with the Knowledge Matters campaign?
So David's going first. I think we have slides also.
I have just one slide.
I have a couple.
Okay. Just quickly, the baseball study that Natalie enumerated, which is so important, was actually replicated. So there was 2 studies showing the same thing. We don't in the research world in education, studies aren't replicated nearly enough. And for all practical purposes, it was replicated 3 times because there was the same study done with soccer. So the evidence for knowledge is huge. The point I'm going to make here, take a look at these bullets for just a quick moment, please, and I'll go over each one in more depth. Okay, first, foundational skills, which I'm sure there's been plenty of talk about today, and that's phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency. Phonemic awareness, although there's some debate in some parts of the literacy community, should include what's sometimes called advanced phonemic awareness or phoneme manipulation. And that's available in both the commercial program, Hegarty, and also on the Tennessee Department of Education. There's a phonemic awareness program called Sounds First, which is free and which Meredith and I put together. So you have to have foundational skills, or as has been said, I'm sure throughout the day, you're not going to go anywhere. Building knowledge through a volume of reading is important. Obviously, what Natalie said is to the point. Informational text grows more knowledge than narrative fiction, but narrative fiction grows a great deal of knowledge as well. An important point there is volume of reading. A lot of effort goes in since the standards to read text at grade level, which we didn't used to do. Students in many programs only, and still even after the standards, only read text at their level. And the best way to read complex text is something called close reading, which you can get a wealth of information on from our website, from the Students Achievement Partners website, achievethecore.org. And it's important to understand that close reading of grade level complex text does a number of things, and I'll come back to them throughout these other constructs. But when you spend a lot of time on one text, you're not going to grow as much knowledge as when you spend time on more than one text on a number of texts. And spending time on a number of texts will grow knowledge and grow vocabulary. And that means that those texts might need to be at a variety of levels, not all grade level or grade level complex text. And the programs that Meredith's going to talk about when I'm done all include that. They include close reading of grade level complex text, and they also include wide reading or a volume of reading of texts at a variety of levels.
Related to that topic. Related to the topic.
Related to the topic. And actually, there was a new study that just came out by James Kim at Harvard, who seems to do a new study every week, showing the importance, especially of the volume of reading in growing knowledge. And interestingly, he also showed it with text from first to third grade. Morphology. Morphology seems to be the least addressed construct of reading. The idea of the parts of a word, prefixes, suffixes, and root words have a strong connection to reading proficiency. And many programs don't provide enough attention to morphology. And morphology is unique in another respect in that it's kind of a bridge between word study or word recognition or phonics and vocabulary. And it makes sense that if students are familiar with root words and familiar with prefixes and affixes, it's going to help not only with vocabulary, but it's going to help with decoding or word recognition. Building vocabulary, the depth and breadth of word knowledge. The breadth of word knowledge is like the dictionary we can carry around between our ears. How many words do we know, at least the most common sense of what they mean? Like ground. Ground means what we put our feet on. Depth means how many different senses of that word do we know? Do we understand also his argument is ungrounded or he has no ground to stand on? That would be a depth of issue. And depth is if any given word, if you know the word sincere, how many synonyms do you know? So you know serious, you know, I forgot the others right now. I had it in my aged brain for a minute, but building vocabulary, the breadth of vocabulary is also how many synonyms a student knows for any given word. The research on vocabulary is literally 100 years old. The importance of depth and breadth of word knowledge. And this is tier 3 vocabulary, which is basically the knowledge or the content, photosynthesis, aspiration, combustion, etc. But it's also tier 2 vocabulary, the most common words that we see in text all the time, such as various and serious, so forth. So a lot of research there. And comprehension. What is it that students have to do? So suppose you have the vocabulary and you have the knowledge and you have the foundational skills. There is research showing that when students have all of that, they still struggle to comprehend the text. Now, if they have all of that, they're going to do better, without a doubt. But what happens with students who have specific comprehension difficulties? Jean Oakhill and Kate Kane have been writing about that for 30 years. There's certain understanding of how a text works, what holds a text together, how do you connect one part of the text to another, why do some students better than others? There's enormous science in that as well. So what we have here is a science of reading that addresses foundational skills, knowledge, especially knowledge through a volume of reading, morphology, vocabulary, and comprehension. In the beginning of this whole science of reading movement, all anybody spoke about was foundational skills. Now there is much more attention to knowledge. I don't think it's like foundational skills yet, but hopefully with work like what we're doing today, it'll catch up. But it needs everything. And the same warning that Natalie talked about applies here. If we don't pay attention to morphology, if we don't pay attention to vocabulary, if we don't pay attention to comprehension, that what we'll have in a very small number of years, because the half-life, how long educational reforms last, is not terribly large. If we don't pay attention to everything, then what's going to happen is we're going to turn around in 3 or 4 years or 5 years and say this whole science of reading, it didn't work. Just like the standards didn't change the NAEP scores nationwide, whole language didn't change the NAEP scores nationwide, charter schools didn't change the NAEP scores nationwide. So science of reading goes into the trash basket of the failed educational reforms. And the overwhelmingly most likely reason for that is programs that don't address all of these constructs and address them well. Meredith is going to address them very well in the next minute or two. And thank you.
And I saw a question flash across from Linda Diamond about syntax, which would be, we would encompass the close attention to syntax, juicy sentences, focused attention to a single sentence, and looking at how syntax operates to communicate meaning would be part of the comprehension. It's part of what the brain does to make meaning. So there is a boatload of research that has not gotten out into the field for application around comprehension, but certainly syntax, we would say, yay, fans of juicy sentence. We would say comprehension, syntax study and comprehension holds a lot of those buckets that need to be explored.
And why it's in comprehension is it's best done in the context of the text, as opposed into taking it out in isolated exercises.
And so these are the basis of the programs that I'm gonna take you on a quick tour through. So the most important thing is to get the link to the website so you can go play with it yourself, because it's highly interactive. And that is blasted across the top of this first slide. It's the knowledgematterscampaign.org out of standards work. And yes, David and I, along with Sue Pimentel, who was lead author of the Common Core State Standards, ELA, and in charge of the whole enterprise, making sure it all happened. We got to be our teammate on this. And so what we did is we designed a website that we would want, that was lean, that was clear, that gave you a chance to go deep off in the margins, but was interactive, which would be accessible to parents, to lay people, to journalists who just had a minute to look, 10 minutes to look, but also people that wanted to explore. And we collaborated with the publishers, all of whom are in the cool bubble featured exhibit space. So they are there. Some are staffed, some of them are lively, but those are less static than what I'm going to show you. So this is the cover page of the Knowledge Matters campaign. And then what we're looking at and bearing down on is explore curricula. But this Visit Classrooms link is a bunch of snippets of classroom practice with these same programs, these same sets of instructional materials. And there are links, very handy links coming through the chat that I can see. So this is just the landing page. And if you go to the next, I'll tell you some of the components in it. I just did snippets. I'm not privileging any of these 6. I love actually different things about all these programs. But this was the clearest one that I knew would reproduce for a virtual conference. So Wit and Wisdom from Great Minds, which is also Eureka Math, which I may have been renamed, but I know it as Eureka, distributed by Great Minds. All of the, speaking to Natalie's point, knowledge inventory, and the really good question that came up in the chat, whose knowledge, who's picking these? Well, the truth is, there have been 2 constituencies that have always held the power of picking topics for our children and our teachers in our classrooms. The publishers, which in the basals are, the scattershot that they include, and they answer to their stockholders, not to their constituents. Most of these are tiny startup companies that are either not-for-profits or certainly small, nimble companies in the scheme of things. So these are the topics K8. We call these a knowledge inventory. So you can glance at these. There's like a carousel, so you can see the topics K8 at a glance, not how they explore them at all, but just what the topics are. So if you're looking for whose knowledge and which ones are more, which ones are more traditional, which ones are more inclusive, which ones flex to a district's design, as American Reading Company does. They'll actually design with a district, etc. So this is the knowledge map, the knowledge inventory for each of these. And then the next slide, please. We also asked each, this is Fish Tank Learning. This is actually an open educational resource, as is Bookworms and EL Education. I know those 3 are open source, meaning they are free to download and use for the cost of print. Now, ELA is never free. These books, this happens to be the Fish Tank K-8 carousel of some of their many books. You always got to buy the books, and there's serious money in the book. So even if the materials, nobody's making a profit off these, you still need good books in front of kids to actually make reading be authentic and real. So all of the publishers also have these book inventories, so you can look at those. And and this is just a representation. So there's also all these other aspects. There are videos of each curriculum enacted in the classroom. You can see they're not 45 minutes long. They are quicker snippets. Many of them were done by the Knowledge Matters campaign school visits. They're I forgot the name, but there's other people on that may load it up in the chat. It doesn't matter. But some of them are literally handheld, iPhone videos. A couple of them were given to us by the publishers, but yes, thank you, Natalie. But anyway, all of these really give you a sense of what it feels like and looks like with children using these materials. And I saw long ago in the chat, somebody from Richmond using EL Education who said, we cannot believe how much richer the classroom discourse and student participation has gotten since we started using EL Education. And that is one of the huge things about these. Everybody is talking about the same real, intellectually demanding topic. They're all invited to grow the same knowledge. So you get passionate discussion. All of these would not have made the cut if they did not honor and privilege and center student-centered discussion as part of daily classroom work. And people in the chat are saying more about that. So there's videos. We ask each publisher to give us a sample unit and lesson and sort of talk about it. So those are highly curated, but they give you in just like 8 or 10 page PDF, a sense of what teacher supports are like, the teacher materials, the student facing materials, what student work comes out of these programs, which obviously is important. And then there's also a description of how each is structured. There were questions about which ones do and do not have integrated foundational skills. And some of them do, some of them partner. So some of them are fully integrated in. And so that is also really clear. We wrote those snapshot descriptions. We did not give those to the marketing departments or individuals at these publishers. Sue, David, and I wrote those so that they were consistent. So you would really have a sense of sort of the flavor of each of these programs. What distinguishes them? We made sure the publishers, we wanted to work with them. This is so they embraced our descriptions, but we controlled the pen on those. Then there are. This was district demanded. We all the districts we consulted with, give us the implementation considerations. If it takes 2 or 3 years to get up to speed on this, let us know. So there are lots of sort of talking head videos with district leaders, with parents, with teachers, a couple of kids, but people who've experienced these programs and speak pretty frankly about them. What the joy is, what the differences are they've seen, what the challenges have been. Because some of these have way quicker on-ramps. So and we really want people to get smart about considerations like we have 30% teacher turnover in our urban district. We can't keep people. So you probably want something that is quicker to learn to be decent at. Otherwise, you're constantly trying to get traction. Some of these programs are so rich that they take a couple years to figure out. But I got to tell you something, you Californians, everything you're using, that 97%, those all take a long time to get traction because it takes a seasoned teacher or a really committed district. Long Beach Unified has done a lot of work with this to learn how to get rid of the fluff and fat from those basals and figure out what's good for kids and what works. That takes a group of teachers working together hard or a really seasoned, confident teacher. Newbies just teach it, try to get through what they can and are always panicked about where they are because those things are fat, your basals, your programs. They have a lot of stuff in them that aren't good for kids and a lot of time gets wasted. So these are much leaner, more focused on the science of reading, all those aspects David talked about. So again, It's a resource. I will stop talking so you can go play with this knowledgematterscampaign.org website. Everybody offers professional learning. I think CORE has partnered with a couple of these. I'm seeing Linda active, and David wants to say one more thing, Todd, before you take back the mic.
A couple of things. And not everything in the programs you're using is wrong for kids.
I didn't say that.
And I'm just being clear. It's not, you know what, teachers, it's very hard to hear as a teacher that, well, we've been doing the wrong thing for X amount of years. Some of the things that we've been doing, whether in any program, do match up with the science of reading, maybe not as much as they should. That's number one. And number two, doing these new programs doesn't mean you're going to give up everything you've learned and everything you've done in the past. The other thing is, teachers don't say that their weakest readers are more motivated than they've ever been before when they use these new programs. They don't say that. What they say is their weaker readers are more motivated than they ever thought they would be. And the reason for that is that everybody is at a significant part of the day reading text, the same text, discussing the same topic. So you no longer have the Fontes and Pinnell or units of literacy apartheid kind of approach. That's a huge reason why these programs have already started to show results, even though they're new and there's been COVID, and that's important. And when you go to the publishers and you start reaching out from the website that Meredith described, you'll be able to get access to some of the results that these programs have.
Thank you, David and Meredith. Hey, we're running a little over time, but we started a little late, so we're going to run another, I think, 5 or maybe even 7 minutes longer. And, one question I wanted to ask is, as we said, almost no districts in California are using any of the reading programs that you just described, David and Meredith. And obviously, a new curriculum is a big lift for any district. So I guess the question is, how important do you think it is? How important do you think it is that schools move from the programs that we have to these new types of programs? And what are you seeing in other parts of the country in terms of the impact these programs are having on student achievement? And I direct that to David and Meredith, but Natalie, also feel free to chime in if you have views on that as well.
It's very hard to put together a program by yourself for the students we need to help the most. You're talking about all those 5 constructs that I described. You're talking about lessons, you're talking about quizzes, you're talking about every element of reading, all 5 of them. That's very difficult to do on your own. So getting a program right is absolutely essential. I don't think there's any way that we can help the vast majority of students we want to help without getting the program right. I mean, it's possible that patches could be made, but that's also very difficult. But getting the program right, implementing the program right, supporting teachers the right way so that they feel supported and they don't feel that their work is being denigrated, or that, as I said earlier, that their past work is being denigrated. I think that's essential. As to the results, correct me if I'm wrong, Meredith, if you go to the website, you'll be able to link to the publishers and get some of the results. Even though these programs have only been around for 3 or 4 years or so, 5, some of them maybe 5 or 6, and then you have COVID for 2, but you're still able to see results in some of these programs. That help, Todd?
Did. Natalie, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I totally agree with everything David just said. I would just add that, curriculum is only the first step. There are a lot of other things you have to do after you adopt a curriculum, but it is a crucial step. And you mentioned that you've got some years to go before there's another curriculum adoption window in California, but I would really urge any district that wants to see results and to help kids who are still dealing with pandemic-related learning loss to act more quickly and to use some of those ESSER funds or whatever is available to them to at least try out some of these curricula, at least do a pilot for one of these curricula or look into maybe more than one, so that I think it's too important to wait for that next adoption window.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One of the things that I think a misconception that a lot of districts have is that they must choose something that's off the state's approved adoption list. I've talked to lots of administrators who have never done anything else and think that's required, and it absolutely is not. I mean, for instance, Lucy Calkins is not on the adoption list, and something like 7% of all districts in California use Lucy Calkins. So it is absolutely not required. You need to show that a curriculum aligns with the California state standards, which presumably the publisher will be very enthusiastic in helping you do. So it can be done. It is done. And I think you made a good point that those ESSER funds this is a great use of ESSER funds. If you want to make a dent in one of the hardest problems that I think most California districts face. Hey, I did want to ask one more question that's that California is quite different from most of the rest of the country, and that we have a very large percentage of English learners. Something on the order of 25 to 35% of all early elementary students are English learners. So how do these programs line up against the needs of English learners?
I can take the first stab at that. So they in different ways, basically, and probably that would be something to look at on the website. So I don't want to pick apart each one. It's because I think some have done a better job than others, and I think that we speak to that on the website. I do want to say that uniquely, as far as I know, in the universe, EL education embedded very good EL experts at the point of creation. So it was not, there's no aftermath or tacked in. An American Reading Company is a fully bilingual company with a fully bilingual dual language edition, and also just given their staffing and philosophy as a small company has also paid a lot of attention there too. So others are working on it, and or else I just don't know. But I do have to call out those two in particular.
What I said about, go ahead, Natalie.
I believe the Amplify version of CKLA has a Spanish language version now. So, and I have one other point, but David, you go ahead and then I'll come back.
ARC has a Spanish language version too. The other thing is what I said about weaker readers being so motivated. There is research showing that when you include English language learners with everybody else, learning the same content and not putting them out in separate exercises, but instead developing language connected to what's being studied, connected with all the students and all the work. That also is supportive, and all of these programs have that.
Yeah, and I know California wrestles with the ELD framework as well, and that is also coming up. And I hope that it'll be less ponderous than it currently is, and less, because it actually keeps some smaller publishers out of the game because they just can't, they don't have the resources to do all the things. But a lot of these programs would walk in, and the language richness of these classrooms is another point I would make in terms of hewing to all the research that I'm familiar with in terms of creating an environment where everybody can thrive, but are particularly pinpointed and supportive, and call out supports in really clear protocols for English learners that are in the room, to make sure with translanguaging and linguistic partnerships and a lot of things that that are really research based. That California is not always back in the dawn of time. California was not so positive about some of those things, but the research is there, and hopefully California is following the research.
If I could just quickly add, I guess, two things. One is that I've certainly heard from teachers that it's often the English language learners who benefit the most, along with the kids who have IEPs or would have been in the low reading groups, who benefit the most from a knowledge building curriculum that gives all kids in the classroom access to the same content. But also, I saw this. I followed a classroom through a school year when I was researching my book, The Knowledge Gap. And most of the kids in that classroom came from non-English speaking families, and some were still English language learners themselves, but they were learning sophisticated vocabulary words like revenge, opponent, foresight. They were using those words. So even though they were still learning English, they were able to understand and retain those sophisticated words because they were encountering them in a very engaging context repeatedly. The second point I'd just like to make is that for English language learners and all students, writing instruction explicit sentence level writing instruction can be hugely valuable, not just for teaching them how to write, that's important, but also for boosting their reading comprehension. Because if you teach kids how to construct a sentence, how to use complex syntax in their own writing, that is a very powerful way of enabling them to understand that kind of syntax when they encounter it in their reading. So for any of these curricula that have rich content, adapting a method like, I will say, the writing revolution to that content is going to be a huge boost to learning.
I agree. It's the analog to encoding and decoding, strengthening each other, foundational skills, deconstructing sentences and then reconstructing them in your own writing is potent.
Well, I could listen to this group all day. This is top level stuff in terms of, bringing to California kind of insight and knowledge about things going on in other parts of the country that reflect the reading research that frankly just haven't been well represented here. So thank you to David and Meredith. Thank you to Natalie. This has just been a great discussion, and I feel like we're both richer for the discussion, and I'm kind of daunted by the level of challenge that we have in front of us in California, because we clearly have a lot we need to do if we want to have the success that we all want to have with California's 6 million students. So thank you both, and thank you for the audience for sticking with us as we went past our appointed hour. And now I'll hand it off to Dr. Childs to close out our conference.